Good deal. So glad to see you all here. Thank you for coming. For those of you who don't remember me, or you haven't ever attended one of my webinars before, I am an AP European history teacher and an AP World History teacher on the East Coast in the United States. I teach exclusively online and I tutor online as well. This is my 14th year of teaching, and I love teaching students from around the world, and I love teaching these webinars because unlike my AP classes, which have a lot of stress and time constraints, I have to get the content delivered by a certain point by the day of the AP exam, and I have to teach how to write essays and things like that. I don't have that time pressure with you all. So I love teaching in this way and to you all. So thank you for coming. I really love our topic for today, and I hope you guys do too. So we're going to be discussing basically the Renaissance and what the Renaissance looked like, where it began in Europe, where it spread, who the big players were for the Renaissance, who what kinds of ideas came out of the Renaissance, and how did they spread, and what did life look like for the average European living during the Renaissance. So this is going to be really an awesome topic. By way of just giving me an idea of what you guys know, what big events do you guys think of when you think of the Italian Renaissance? Just throw things in the chat pod. Anything at all that you think of when you think of the Italian Renaissance. Destroy the church. Okay, we kind of talked about the church last webinar. Protestants, okay. That is a really good thing to mention. A lot of people don't associate the Protestant Reformation with the Renaissance, but they were at the same time. So yeah, that's huge. The Protestant Reformation, we're going to be talking about that with the next webinar. Well, no worries. If you don't know a lot, that's totally fine. Hopefully I can help you guys out today so you have a better idea of what to think of when you think of the Italian Renaissance. Okay. Gotcha. All right. Well, let's go ahead and see how I can help you guys get a better handle on this content. So, I'm actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to move my video down here. Can you guys see the PowerPoint okay? Awesome. Actually, maybe I'll move the chat down here if you don't mind. You can still see it now that I've moved the chat? Awesome. Okay. Okay, so we're looking at Europe from roughly 1453 to 1533 today. And the big things that we see during this time period is the Byzantine Empire is kind of shrinking due to outside forces during this time. Greek speaking and reading, or what had been Byzantium, I should say, not entirely the Byzantine Empire, since that's from a while ago, but it was shrinking due to outside forces. And we see Greek speakers and people who were able to read and write, and who were especially educated, flocking to Italy, specifically from one of the reasons why we see Greek speakers like taking refuge in Italy from the Middle East is because the Ottoman Empire is growing at this time. And we're actually going to talk about them first before we get into the Italian Renaissance, because they're a big reason why we see kind of this migration of educated people moving to Italy, and that kind of starts the Italian Renaissance. And so when they fled from what had been the Byzantine Empire and was now the Ottoman Empire, once they had fled, they took with them many of their classical texts. And we'll talk about what we mean by classical in a minute. So Renaissance scholars used classical texts in new ways, with a new emphasis on going back to the ancient Romans and even the ancient Greeks before the Romans. They loved ancient, we'll call it Greco-Roman learning, and they really focused on that. So can I ask you guys, what does the word Renaissance mean? Does anyone know? Close? The word Renaissance actually means a rebirth. Okay. And so just to give you kind of some context here, if you go all the way back to the Roman Empire, it fell in the 400s. I think it was 476 CE or AD. And after that, a lot of what had been the western part of the Roman Empire had kind of collapsed and shrunk down into small, people left the cities. Western Europe became very feudal. I think I talked about feudalism with you guys in previous webinars. Maybe you remember. During periods of unrest and instability, when there's a lot of outside attackers, oftentimes in world history, we see people kind of turn to this feudal kind of system. It's not like they're like, oh, we're being attacked, let's become feudal. But this just kind of naturally happens. People leave the cities, they hunker down in the countryside, and most of the population that doesn't have a lot of money or an army at their disposal will live close to someone with an army, right? Because if they're scared for their lives, they want to be near an army that can protect them. And so they oftentimes worked the land for the local lord, the kind of the wealthier person who owned the land, who had an army at his disposal and who could offer them that protection. And so feudalism reigned in Western Europe for a long time, until slowly but surely we see kind of the formation of nation states, which we talked about in one of my first webinars. And then once that happened and things started to broil over, we get to kind of the high Middle Ages with the Hanseatic League, a lot of trade, good things happening. And then the Mongols, of course, were attacking far to the east in Asia and even as far as Russia, right? You remember the Mongols? You guys remember talking about the Mongols? Anyone? Hopefully. Stay with me. I know I haven't launched into my PowerPoint yet. I'm just giving you some context first. Okay, Michael remembers the Mongols. Awesome. So because of that, what happened? What spread from Asia to the rest of Afro-Eurasia after the Mongol rule? Yeah, to a somewhat of a degree, meritocracy. I'll give you a hint. Yes, Yolanda, the Black Death. Right. And so the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, we've already talked about it, was devastating to the populations everywhere that it spread. Asia, Africa, parts of Africa that were involved in trade around the Mediterranean, especially, and for sure Europe. Okay. So that brought us up to kind of my discussion from last webinar, which was the end of January, where I talked about issues between the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church and the various monarchs of Europe. Do you remember that discussion? And Philip, who destroyed the Knights Templar, and the Avignon papacy, where the Pope moved to Avignon, France, and then we had this great schism, and then the time of the three popes. Remember the time of the three popes? That was crazy, right? Yeah, it was crazy. So now we're finally looking at things are starting to recoup, okay? And part of the reason for that is the conquest of the Ottoman Empire. They conquer a very, very important city. Does anyone want to guess what city the Ottoman Turks conquer in 1453? Yes, awesome job. High five. Yes, Constantinople. So we turn our attention now to the Ottomans real quick, okay? And then we'll talk about what happens in 1453 in more depth, okay? Okay, so the Turkish Ottomans rose to power under the leadership of Osman, pictured down here on the bottom right with the amazingly large white hat. They began as Islamic warrior bands, meaning they roamed around conquering, okay? They defeated their rivals and conducted a holy war, or a jihad, against the Christian Byzantines, okay? The Byzantine Empire, again, had been kind of like the second Rome in what had been the eastern part of the Roman Empire, okay? And, Emperor Constantine, going back to the time of the Roman Empire, had moved the capital of the Roman Empire from the city of Rome to Byzantium, the city of Byzantium. And he was a really humble guy. He renamed the city of Byzantium what? This is going all the way back to like the 300s CE. Constantinople. He named it after himself, okay? Well, now, fast forward to the time we're at here, the Ottoman Turks are going to play into this, okay? So keep that in mind. So they were based in the city of Bursa, and the Ottoman Turks established a system of rule that attracted and included educated people, specifically educated people who moved to the cities, okay? At the top of their system, the political system, sat a sultan who oversaw both the military and civilian bureaucracies, the different departments of government. By the mid-16th century, so when you think 16th century, you need to say to yourself, okay, wait, that's the 1500s, okay? Remember, when we say 16th century, whenever it's put like that, that means it's the 1500s. Or 17th century, that means it's the 1600s, and so on, okay? So you got to kind of do that mental shift when I say something like that. So by the mid-1500s, the Ottomans had expanded into the Balkans as the most powerful force in the Southwest Asia and much of Europe, okay? And then this is a huge date to remember. If you don't remember much from class today, remember this date, okay? In 1453, just as the 100 Years' War was coming to an end. Do you remember me talking about the 100 Years' War for those of you who were at my previous webinar? The fight over who had the right to the French throne. Was it an English king or a French king? And they were fighting over French lands as well. Do you remember that? And Joan of Arc came on the scene as well and then was burned at the stake. Yeah, ultimately they do. The British really won for a good bit of it because of the longbow. Remember talking about the longbow and how much damage it could do to your enemy. But ultimately the French were able to get it back and win. So yeah, so anyway, just as that 100 Years' War was coming to an end in 1453, the Ottomans were able to conquer the city of Constantinople. And this is huge. It was a huge siege of the city. Much of the city was destroyed. Apparently, when the ruler of the time came and saw the destruction of the city, he was so saddened by what his armies had done to the city. But they conquer Constantinople, 1453. They rename it what? Yeah, they rename it Istanbul. Yeah. With this conquest, this is important, the Ottomans seized control of Europe's access to the Indian Ocean trade. Now, does anyone want to venture a guess? Do you think the Indian Ocean trade was pretty lucrative at this time in history? Meaning you could make, what do you think? Yeah, for sure. Europe wanted access to that Indian Ocean trade, okay? But now they're going to be blocked by the Ottoman Empire that now has Constantinople, renamed it Istanbul, okay? Anyway, so we'll talk about that down the road too and how that hurt Europe. But military successes like these paved the way for the Ottomans to rise to power, okay? And the Ottoman Empire, honestly, is one of the longest empires, if not the longest lasting empire in European history, okay? Conquest of Constantinople and other territories generated financial rewards. While many were sad at the fall of the Byzantine Empire capital, the city of Constantinople, the people who fled Constantinople and the surrounding areas, Greek speakers who were educated, fled to the Italian city-states like Florence and Milan and a few other big ones, okay? They took all of their learning, all of their knowledge, and their classical texts, their books, with them, okay? Keep that in mind, okay? That's going to spark the Italian Renaissance, okay? Okay, a little more about the Ottomans, and then I promise we're getting to the Italian Renaissance, okay? Although the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans caused a huge psychological shock to Europe, there were only minor economic impacts on European trade, and they were mostly felt in the city-state of Venice. For the Ottomans, the successful conquest meant a huge increase in wealth and power for the Turks, as never seen before, for them at least. Their conquest also facilitated the need for a larger Ottoman army and administration, since they had more land, more territory to oversee, they needed a larger government and a larger army to enforce the laws of that government. Okay. Much of these armies were actually made up of slaves, and the need for slaves only increased as the size of the Ottoman Empire grew. Slaves provided the Ottoman upper class with an elevated status sometimes, okay? Slaves were also used as household servants and administrators in the government, and they were mostly obtained through conquest, okay? Some of the captured preferred slavery over peasantry, so they remained as slaves with few incidents of escape or uprising. But sadly, there was also a practice that the Ottomans did called child slavery. It was called the defshirme, which was used and helped to pay what they called the child tax. There wasn't as much of a social stigma with slavery that as you and I would associate with the word at this point in history, but it was still kind of horrific because basically Christians living in Southeastern Europe, once the Ottoman Empire would come to their local town or village, they would require them to literally give one of their sons to the Ottomans, and they would never see them again. Like here's my son, I'm never seeing him again. Okay, so that was pretty brutal. And I've heard some historians say, yeah, but those sons then went on to serve in government and they had a better life and blah, blah, blah. But still, you're ripped apart from your family at a young age, never to see them again. That's not so great. Okay. Am I missing any questions so far? You guys talking about Russia? Don't worry, we will talk about Russia in the future. And good call, whoever said, yeah, the Eastern Orthodox Church is what's going to influence Russia. Nice. Okay, but we're going back to the Ottoman Empire. I'm just setting the stage again. If you're lost right now, I'm just doing a quick 2 to 3 slides on the Ottoman Empire to set the stage for the Italian Renaissance and European Renaissance. Okay. Muslims also, again, the Ottoman Empire was primarily made up of Muslims. They were prohibited from enslaving other Muslims, but unlike their slaves who could move up in society, Muslims were oftentimes excluded from social and political advancement. And some slaves were even able to reach elite positions in the Ottoman government, interestingly enough. Okay, now we need to turn our attention to the Italian Renaissance. Okay, first of all, when I say classical in this discussion, I want you to remember that I mean learning from ancient Greece and Rome. Okay, now you might not know much about ancient Greece and Rome, or maybe you do know some, but it's not required that you know a lot about it in order to understand the influence that ancient Greek and Roman learning had on this time in history. Because you might be thinking, wait a minute, ancient Greece, that's BC and or BCE, if you want to put it that way, or the Roman Empire, that was destroyed by 476 CE. Why are we talking about it when we're in 1453 to 1530? Well, it's going to influence the people of this day in Europe, okay? So pictured here on the slide, we have Francesco Petrarch, the father of humanism. So Francesco Petrarch was a scholar and poet who was responsible for the recovery of manuscripts and works of Greek and Roman writers, okay? He believed that if people forgot about the classics from ancient Greece and Rome, it would contribute to their ignorance and living in darkness, okay? He admired and desired to recover the classical past, again, classical meaning ancient Greece and Rome, giving rise to a rebirth in knowledge known as the Renaissance. Again, when you think Renaissance, and let's stay on topic, guys, think rebirth, because believe it or not, this time is definitely going to influence us down the road in world history, okay? So the classical canon, or what I mean by that is a compilation of different works, different writings, contained works of classics by writers like Livy, Tacitus, and Lucretius, and they resurfaced and spread throughout Renaissance society, okay? So ancient Greek and Roman writings started to spread. Also, the borders of Byzantium shrunk due to outside forces, conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans, And Greek-speaking and reading members of an intellectual type took refuge in Italy. Like I said, they fled and they took their familiarity with these classical texts with them. Renaissance scholars used classical texts in new ways with a new emphasis to try and recapture the way that ancient Greek and Romans thought and the values that they had. And basically they were trying to say, okay, how do we catch Europe and Europeans who are in the dark? They've been in this dark age since the Roman Empire fell back in the 400 CE. How do we catch them up after so long? How do we educate them and bring them up to where they can have a better life? Okay. So Italy became the birthplace of the Renaissance. Why Italy? Well, first you have to think about the fact that Northern Italy was inhabited by aristocrats who were either wealthy from banking or trade, okay? Think of this Italian city-states, especially in Northern Italy, run by wealthy people who earn their wealth through banking or trade. These newly wealthy families had sons they wanted to educate, and they wanted them to become impressive public figures. So they wanted them to be educated in the classical learning. Again, classical ancient Greece and Roman learning. Okay, so that kind of created this class of independent intellectuals, educated intellectuals, especially in the northern city-states. And Italian schools and tutors also produce the best educated laymen of all of Europe. So everyone, it's like, you know, if you live in an area where there's the best school to go to, and your parents and your family want you to go to that best school because you're going to get the best education, you know, get into the best universities, get the best jobs. That's kind of the culture that was brewing up in these northern Italian city-states. They wanted a really strong education for their sons. Okay, during the Renaissance, those who mastered skills in the visual arts or poetry or music or science or engineering, these people became known as all-around men. Okay, have you guys ever heard of the term, oh, that person's a Renaissance man? Have you guys ever heard that term? No? Okay. Maybe you will someday. But basically, if you ever hear that, it's referring to someone who is educated in many different ways and good at a lot. Like they have a lot of hobbies, they know a lot, they're very well studied, very well versed in many different things. You know, they're not just good at just one thing, they're good at many different things. Okay, that's where this came from, this idea of the all-around man. In modern times, we sometimes refer to people who have multiple talents as Renaissance men. So back at this time in history, these all-around men were able to capitalize on their talents because oftentimes they were commissioned, got paid by wealthy Italian merchants. And this started a system called patronage, where people who were really talented, either like a talented painter or, you know, sculptor, or very well versed in politics, a really good writer, if they didn't have the money themselves, if they could find a patron, and a patron again was oftentimes a wealthy banker or wealthy merchant. If they could find someone to be their patron, then they could just full-time focus on what they were good at. You know, think of the famous artists from the Italian Renaissance: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael. All of these artists had patrons to pay them so that they can continue to do what they were good at. Okay. So the results of this patronage saw the emergence of, like I said, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Botticelli, Galileo, Machiavelli, and Raphael. Have you guys ever heard of any of those names? Hopefully you have, at least of one. Michelangelo, maybe? Okay, few. Yeah, good, cool. Maybe you've heard of Raphael or Leonardo da Vinci. Good. Nice. So this rebirth, again, Renaissance meaning rebirth in human expression, all boiled down to actually economics. Before the Renaissance, people were tied to the earth in a subsistence farming system. The only way they could survive is to spend most of their day working the land, okay? Or they would starve. But not at this time in Italian Renaissance history. Now, for the first time, people didn't have to spend all their time tilling and harvesting just to survive, okay? Once food became more readily available after the Black Death, do you guys remember that? Remember after the Black Death, if you survived, life was better for you. Do you remember this? You know, it was awful for the people who died, very sad for them. But for the survivors, it meant there were fewer workers, right? Do you remember this? So they could actually bargain for higher wages. Okay, I'll go out and, till the soil and harvest the wheat, but I want more money. And because there weren't as many people around, they had the people who own the land, their employers had to pay them more. And so by and large, they had more money. They had a wider variety of food to eat. They had more than one pair of clothing. So life was getting better for them. They didn't have to just spend all of their time working the land just to make it, to survive, okay? And with that, the amount of food and the variety of food increased. And as you can imagine, that meant healthier people and supporting a higher population of people. Ultimately, the population started to rebound, okay? So once food became more readily available after the Black Death, people were able to move away from subsistence farming, where you're literally just farming enough food to eat yourself so you don't starve to death. People were able to move away from that and obtain their food from markets instead of the land itself, okay? In Florence, in particular, the economy was so good, it even allowed the formation of a class system within society. Whereas before, most people were just like peasants who worked the land, and then you had your various lords who own the land, and then maybe a merchant here and there and a knight here and there to help protect people. But we didn't see a lot of different layers in the social class pyramid during the feudal period in Europe, okay? But in Florence in particular, at this time, the economy was so good, it even allowed for the formation of a more detailed class system within society. Once the system was simply made up of, like I said, peasants, knights, nobles, clergy, kings, what occurred was the development of subsystems and subcultures. And people were free to express themselves at an individual level rather than a group one. Okay? A new class known as the Grandi were the old rich members of society who stemmed from the nobles and wealthy merchants of the medieval time. Then the Popolo Grosso were the newly rich. Okay, I'll put this in the chat pod so you can see. They were people who had gained their wealth from banking and trade and things like that. The middle burghers were the guild masters, shop owners, and professional yet smaller businessmen. And then there were the Populo Minotto, who were the lower economic class. They were the paupers. They were the ones kind of doing the jobs no one wanted to do or working the land. Okay, so this new form of social stratification of how society was kind of organized occurred because of the geographic location of the Italian city-state of Florence, their luck in where they were located in terms of trade, and the decline in populations after the Black Death. So the wealthier in society, both old wealth and new wealth, desired to prove their social status by supporting new trends in the arts and by getting, if I pay this artist to come in and paint this beautiful mural on my wall in my home, it will show everyone that we've arrived, that we have, it's like nowadays, how do people show off their wealth nowadays? What do you guys see where you live? When people make it big and have a really great job, okay, expensive cars. Hopefully not, but yeah, you can see it in the clothes that they wear, the kinds of toys that they buy for themselves, really nice cars. This, human nature hasn't changed. Same thing is at work here for people in the city-state of Florence and other city-states in Italy. People still want to show off their wealth, okay? But the way you did it back then is you hired artists to come in and beautify your home, painting murals on the wall of an ancient Greek backdrop, or sculpting a statue of a Greek goddess and putting it in your front hall, things like that. That was a way to show off your wealth, okay? So the Renaissance began in Italy, leaving behind a legacy in the arts, which still persists until this day, okay? Now, I don't know how many of you enjoy discussing art. I really like it because I think this is a neat thing that we can really discuss well in the Italian Renaissance and the European Renaissance, okay? So one cool thing to notice, if you ever look at a piece of art from before the Renaissance and then a piece of art from during the Renaissance, I want you to notice one thing. I want you to think about the self-awareness of the artist, okay? So hear me out on this. So in order to kind of pinpoint the transition from medieval art, medieval European art, to Renaissance art, you have to take into consideration the attitude of self-awareness, okay? So jump back to what I'm talking about here so you guys can follow along with this. This is an interesting argument I'm going to make here, and I want to see if you agree with me. You don't have to agree with me, but I want to see if you do. So back during the medieval period and the Dark Ages in European history, the status quo had remained much the same for hundreds of years, okay? The poor were poor, the rich were rich. There was a huge gap in between them. Kings had all the power, the church had all the power, okay? And you just hope that you live long enough to see, children survive, and that was it, okay? And so that definitely had an impact on the art from that time period. And then during those centuries, Constantinople fell, the Ottoman Turkish conquest of southeastern Europe also occurred. The seafaring journeys, which defined the age of exploration, which I'm going to be talking about in a couple webinars from now, people started exploring overseas after the New World was supposedly discovered, because that happens around the same time too. A lot of this is happening at the same time, okay? Someone said at the beginning of class, I think of the Protestants and the church, during this period of time. But yeah, that's going on. The Protestant Reformation's about to happen. The age of exploration, Columbus, Europeans, exploring and conquering the New World, that happens at the same time. And then the Italian Renaissance and the European Renaissance. It's huge. So many big things happening in this short span of time, okay? So, so we see these big events reflected in art, and it definitely has an impact on the art of the day, okay? We see even during the age of exploration, what I'm going to talk about in webinar 6 is we even see competition among the European powers in the New World, grabbing at land and colonies as fast as they can, okay? And then we see the spiritual challenge by Martin Luther and eventually the Protestant Reformation against the Roman Catholic Church. All of these big things, to our mind's eye, we're kind of like, yeah, we know they happen. That's fine and great. But these were huge events to the people of the day, and they really impacted the way that they thought. So that's going to be reflected in the art that we see, okay? So by the time those events occurred, the Renaissance was well underway. But a definitive moment, which marked the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance, did occur in quite an unexpected way. The Renaissance period was the first time in history in which its members became aware of their own existence within history's time frame, okay, timeline. Medieval people didn't think themselves as any different from those who existed during ancient Greece and Rome. To them, the past was simply before Jesus Christ came and lived and died, and after. So what does the self-awareness which occurred during the Renaissance mean when it came to expression in art? Renaissance members were reviving the classics in literature, philosophy, and art. As Francesco Petrarch defined his new sense of the individual, he also was defining his time in history as distinct, as different from ancient Greece and Rome, from the feudal Dark Ages. He thought his time period was special and unique, okay? So although classical art can't be recreated, they thought we can try. Although we can't paint exactly like the ancient Greek and Roman artists could, we can try to bring back what they did. So the Renaissance artists tried to do that. They tried to even surpass the styles from ancient Greece and Rome. So Renaissance artists discovered the power they had for expression. And what that meant was they had to go out into the world and practice their art until they became a master of their art. And so that's what we see. The pursuit of mastery is what we see in the Renaissance. We see it in sculpture, architecture, painting, and we definitely see the self-awareness of many of these artists. Okay, so have you guys ever heard of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? Anyone? I'm really dating myself here because when I remember watching the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Okay, you've heard of it. Okay. So it was definitely a cartoon when I was a kid, okay? And I thought it was really cool, and I had a crush on Michelangelo. He was the orange turtle. Yeah, so basically the story that I heard for how they came up with the show was it was a bunch of freshman guys at Harvard, okay? This is how they came up with the idea for the show Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And the Renaissance artists here on the slide all have the masks that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles wore, okay? But the story goes that they were 4 freshman guys in college sitting in their dorm room, on a Friday night eating pizza, or Thursday night maybe. And one of them had some pet turtles, I guess, in his dorm room. And one of them was cramming for an art history exam, which he was going to have to take the next day. And of course, in the art history class, he was studying the Italian artists from the Renaissance. And so, just as like freshman guys in college are like, hey, dude, what if there were these cool like ninjas who were, kind of like the Renaissance Italian artists, but they were ninjas and they were turtles. What if they were turtles? Ooh, and they like pizza too. And then they just kept going and going, and the story kind of developed from there. And it became a cartoon, and I liked it when I was a girl. So there you go. You guys probably don't have any idea what I'm talking about, but if you're curious, after class, check it out. See if you can find any clips of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the original series on YouTube, and then you'll know what I'm talking about. It's probably really cheesy by today's standards, but I thought it was funny. Okay, so the finest sculptor of the Renaissance was probably Donatello, not just a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. His statue of Saint Mark shows the characteristics of this new era. Whereas the Gothic sculptures of the High Middle Ages carved what they saw of the surface, like an arm or a leg or a face, Donatello considered sculpture from a more three-dimensional viewpoint. He believed the body provided the framework on which fabrics drape. So the body underneath the clothes should be considered first before the surface of the clothes themselves. So Donatello methodically approached his work. He would first create a body in the nude, in clay, then drape it with fabric soaked in clay, and then use the final dried model as a model for his final masterpiece. Leonardo da Vinci is probably the most famous name from the Italian Renaissance. You've probably heard his name. He was like the quintessential legit Renaissance man, okay? He was the all-around man. He was a master of many skills. Although he was clearly one of the greatest painters of all time, he was also a brilliant military engineer. Have you guys ever heard of this? This is really cool. You can see this picture down here. And he had drawing sketches for flying machines. I think this was his design for, now I'm trying to remember. I don't think I put it in my notes. If you're ever curious, it might have been for a tank, but I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, I think it was a tank. But he had a lot of designs for weaponry that, of course, had never even been heard of and would not be developed for hundreds of years. But he kind of came up with early versions of the tank, of the airplane, of other things like that, which was really cool. So he believed strongly in scientific experimentation. He was also a skilled botanist. He worked with plants. He dissected corpses in order to learn human anatomy, which kind of was not what you were supposed to do back then. The church said you shouldn't, but that's one of the best ways to learn about human anatomy, right? He was, like I said, he foresaw machines, the invention of machines, way ahead of his time. He conceived, like I said, he conceived of machines like the airplane and the submarine. And of course, his most famous painting is of the Mona Lisa, in which he really captures the mood of his subject. Okay, I'm going to kind of speed up here a little bit so we can get farther. Raphael, you should remember him as someone who did many paintings of Madonnas, basically a picture of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And probably his most famous is the School of Athens, which I have pictured on a slide coming up. I'm sure you guys have seen the School of Athens at one point or another. And then Michelangelo. The thing you should remember Michelangelo for is not only his 18-foot tall statue of David, but also the Sistine Chapel. Okay. Has anyone ever been to Rome? No? Okay. Well, if you're ever able to go to Rome someday, I was able to study abroad in Rome when I was in college, and it was remarkable. It was amazing to be able to go and study art history in Rome. So definitely see if you can go. If you can, try and go to Florence and see the statue of the David. It's amazing. Or go to Rome and see the Sistine Chapel. I got to see that. It was amazing. My neck was so sore from looking up at the Sistine Chapel when I was there, but it's breathtaking. Okay, another interesting thing that I really want to talk about is the printing press. And the reason why this is super important is because I'm trying to think of, I think the best comparison for you all, though I'm sure you all kind of can't conceive of life without the internet, but I can. Okay. When I was a kid, you know, we didn't have the internet, right? We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have, I remember being in high school and email was a big thing. I was like, oh, I can send an email to my friends. This is amazing. Right. And then it wasn't until college that they had instant messaging. And that was a big thing. You could chat with your friends online at the same time. That was huge. And then, eventually other things started happening. So it's probably hard for you guys to picture what life was like before the internet, but I can. But the printing press, the invention of the printing press, which obviously Johann Gutenberg was not someone who started printing, from scratch. He built off of earlier models, and obviously, I mean, printing had been done for thousands of years in ancient China, but his printing press was huge for the Renaissance. Okay, so suddenly, what took a very long time to copy by hand could be printed incredibly fast and distributed, and not just writing, but pictures as well. Okay, eventually could be printed and spread. So what do you think this would do for the spread of ideas during the Renaissance? Being able to quickly put your ideas on a piece of paper and post it somewhere, or put it in a book and spread it around. What effect did you think this had on people at this time? I'll put it this way. What kind of impact did the cell phone have when cell phones first came out? What impact did that have on people? Yeah, yeah. Going all the way back to classical Han, which was contemporary. It was before the Roman Empire, but it was contemporary to part of the Roman Empire as well. But yeah, they've been printing for a long time as well. Yeah, changed how we live forever. Yeah, I mean, the influence of the iPhone, I don't have to tell you guys that. You understand. It connects us very quickly, right? But the printing press was huge because suddenly ideas could spread so much faster, especially the learning of the classical age of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Printed books were cheap to make, and interestingly enough, the economy went up with printing because a book trade started where there was a whole process for the construction of books and pamphlets. So people earned a living that way, and then there became bookstores and merchants and trade. So all of that helped with a greater cash flow in terms of the economy as well. As with anything, there's always going to be people in society who are afraid of change, especially with something as hugely impactful as the printing press. And there's always going to be people in society who are so afraid of something new that they stop it from happening. They try to censor and control what is printed and circulated and what is not. And so that's going to happen all around the world from this point moving forward. But what had happened. Now the printing press is going to mean that ultimately more of the population is going to learn how to read, and more ideas will spread quickly, and communication will happen faster in that regard as well. Okay. The other interesting, so real quick, how were books copied in Europe before this point? Paper books are so scary. That's funny. Real quick, how do you think books were copied before the printing press in European history? Think about it. Stone print. No, in Europe, written by hand. Yeah, scribes, monks. No, I'm not talking about Chinese history. I'm talking about European history at this point. Yeah, China was likely the first civilization to come up with an early version of printing. Not as it's going to look quite differently, but yeah, Han China was probably the first. But in terms of European history, think about the fact that they just went through a feudal dark age. The way that they copied books before this point was by hand, which took a long time. And it was harder to correct mistakes if you made a mistake. Well, the printing press, it was easier to make correct mistakes if you made a mistake. Okay, I just wanted to real quick pause for a second. So some of the artwork that people made. Yes, yeah, so I did mention some of those with the last slide. I talked about, maybe you typed that before I got there, but yeah, Donatello did a lot of sculpture. His statue of Saint Mark from the Bible. Da Vinci, of course, not only his big thing was the Mona Lisa. Raphael was his School of Athens, which if you can't picture what that is, I'm going to have it on a slide in a little bit here, but you can always Google it. Just Google image it, and you'll see School of Athens, and you'll probably say, "Oh yeah, I've seen that before." Michelangelo, 18-foot tall David, which you can see pictured down here on the screen, and then also the Sistine Chapel. Those are some examples. Okay, so let's keep on keeping on here. You guys doing okay? You with me? I hope. Okay, by now you've already learned how the Renaissance affected the world of art, but there was more to the Renaissance than just its production of art and literature. Technology, religion, science, and government all began to feel the effects of the new movement as it spread throughout the European continent. So Italy was divided into city-states, and by the 15th century, so the 1400s, the five big powers of Italy were Venice, Florence, Milan, the Papal States where the Pope lived, and the Kingdom of Naples. Okay. Okay. So it began in Italy. You guys know that by now. The Renaissance began in Italy, specifically Florence. So Florence, like I said, had become really rich through trade and banking. Okay. It had a lot of power, some sway over the Catholic Church. It increased in wealth, and people started importing luxury goods. Again, like I said before, human nature hasn't changed. When people get rich, they want to show it off. That was the case in Florence at this time. Okay. So people started asking talented artists to come and beautify their homes and, create sculptures and things like that. The big family of Florence at this time were the Medicis. Okay, maybe you've heard of them. They were a banking family who pretty much ruled the city-state of Florence. Okay, they were big in civics. They wanted to raise their sons to be good, to do their civic duty and be good public leaders and speakers. Okay, so that's Florence. Then the Renaissance spread northward. So it started in Florence in the Italian city-states, and then it spread north. And it's interesting because it spread to Germany, Flanders, France, Spain, England, the Netherlands, all of these areas. It's going to look a little bit different from the Italian Renaissance, okay? So in Italy, art and sculpture were very religious, and they were oftentimes religious figures from the Christian Bible set with an ancient Greek and Roman background, Greek or Roman background, okay? In the Northern Renaissance, arts and ideas were more focused on the individual and everyday life. It was more realistic in that way, okay? So that's something interesting. If I have time, maybe before my next webinar, I'll show you a quick comparison between an Italian Renaissance piece of art and a Northern European Renaissance piece of art. And hopefully you'll be able to quickly see, oh yeah, I can see how they're different. One other name you should really know at this time is Machiavelli, okay? Machiavelli is a word that oftentimes in the English language we use as an adjective for Machiavellian. And it basically means a ruler that is really harsh in order to maintain order. Okay? Harsh rule. When you think of Machiavellian used as an adjective, but think of a harsh ruler who's trying to maintain power and order. Okay? So he was basically a man who lived in Florence at the time of the Medicis, and he was a writer. His two major works were Discourses on Livy and The Prince. And his perspective was that humans were generally bad, that they needed a strong ruler in order to maintain order so that we wouldn't run around killing each other, okay? And one of my favorite memes is on this slide. It says, people are kind, honest, and naturally good. JK, they are weak and easily manipulated. Okay, which is what Machiavelli truly believed. He thought, again, people need a strong ruler so they don't run around killing each other. Okay. And so he basically said, look, if you're a ruler, it is always better to be feared than loved. It is better to be feared than loved. If you don't remember anyone else, remember that Machiavelli said that. Okay. He said, look, if you're loved as a ruler, people are just going to walk all over you and everything's going to fall apart. But if you're in a position of power, it's better to be feared. It's better for people to be afraid of you than for them to like you, because if they're afraid of you, they'll do what you say. Okay. And he might have been right to a certain degree. Obviously, we've all met a teacher who was way too friendly with the students and no one respected the teacher, and people just kind of goofed off in their class, right? We've all known that. Or a babysitter who was really relaxed and just wanted to be your friend, and you kind of tried to do whatever you could to do what you wanted, right? Whereas if you had someone who's stern and strict but fair, you were more likely to do your work, right? Okay, I think this is probably a good stopping point so I can have a few minutes for questions. Let me go ahead and stop my share. So I'm sure you've had questions up till now. I hope I answered the earlier ones, but can I open it up for a minute or two of questions?
Hey, today you talked about a little about the Black Plague and about the workers that you talked about. They survived in the Black Plague, which was really good for them. I like to ask. It can be a turning point in the European history, like for the workers. Can it really be a turning point for them to make them really wealthier, or to survive a really good life for after the Black Plague that they survived?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I don't know that, and I'm glad you said it that way. So the people who survived, they did have more money. They weren't wealthy by any means. I'm talking about most of the people, most of the population who before the Black Plague worked as farmers, and they were just making just enough money to survive, right? If there was a famine or anything like that, they could easily starve to death, or bad crop yield or bad weather, they could easily starve to death. But after the Black Plague, for those who survived, it wasn't quite so bad for them. They weren't just like making just enough. They were making more. So they could afford a wider variety of food. They could afford to buy some of their food from a market instead of just eating from the land that they've worked. They could afford a second pair of clothing. Okay. Some even before the Black Death, they stayed in one place their entire life. They never moved. But after the Black Plague, some of them even had the money to migrate around and work at different farms. So their lives definitely were better after the Black Plague. Great question.
Thanks.
Sure thing. Great. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I hope to see you in my next webinar next Saturday night. We'll talk a little bit more about the Italian Renaissance, and then we'll move on to the Protestant Reformation. So I hope to see you all there.